Imagine the Grand Hotel National in Lucerne, Switzerland, in the early morning hours of August 23rd, 1904. The flicker of gas lamps dances over the marble floors, while a hush blankets the corridors. Suddenly, that hush ruptures into a hearty wail. Baby Thelma Morgan has arrived. And then another cry. Her twin sister Gloria is also here. Their mother Laura stares at her two brand new daughters with equal parts astonishment and, in a twist many might see as shocking, opportunism. Laura Morgan was a person who believed to her core that the Morgans came from Spain's royal house of Navarre, though whether there was real evidence for that is shaky. Still, she repeated it like a mantra, and she intended to shape her daughters' lives and identities around what she considered their regal heritage. Perhaps that sounds glamorous, but for Thelma, it quickly meant a life colored by her mother's mercurial moods, abrupt rages, and ever-shifting demands. The first few months of Thelma's life flew by in a flurry of hotels, visits, international moves, and the typical hustle that came from being the daughter of an American diplomat. One day, they'd be in Lucerne. Before you knew it, they were off to Barcelona. All this hopscotching might sound exciting, but for a small child, it was disorienting at best. And for Thelma, it came with an extra complication: her mother's severe rules, which included a directive that everyone around them speak only Spanish. Picture a little girl who'd already started to chatter away in French, now told she must drop her first language. Then add a mother who would blow up in shrieking fury over the smallest infractions, like not returning a borrowed nail file, only to turn around and lavish her daughters with hugs, kisses, and apologies mere hours later. That roller coaster of love and anger could leave any child so confused that she'd cling to the source of both the affection and the pain. And cling Thelma did. By her own admission, she was so fully attached to her mother that existing independently felt impossible. Her mother was both caretaker and tyrant. Her presence signified safety, but it also sparked waves of anxiety. That anxiety sometimes grew into outright horror, as Thelma found out in an especially gruesome episode involving her beloved pigeons. Thelma's mother had been away in America, and during that time the family physician gifted Thelma and her twin sister a pair of pigeons. The girls adored these creatures. Soon their adorable new pets even had a brood of baby chicks. When Thelma's mother finally returned, Thelma rushed up to her, brimming with excitement, expecting smiles and perhaps a little envy. Instead, she got a response that can only be described as horrifying. First, her mother told a servant to release the adult pigeons. That alone was shocking for a child so attached to her pets. Next, and far more disturbing, she ordered the baby chicks to be slaughtered, cooked, and served for dinner. Imagine that moment for a little girl, your sweet, fluffy companions, the ones you've been feeding and cooing over, suddenly served up on a plate. Thelma refused to eat them. This small act of defiance earned her mother's wrath, but it also underscored how complicated her emotions toward her mother had become. She still loved her mother with a fierce loyalty, and that same fierce loyalty was about to throw her into a whirlwind of intercontinental travel, war, heartbreak, and scandal. By 1913, Thelma's father took a new job assignment in Germany. Typically, this meant the whole family would move, but Laura Morgan simply refused to go, insisting she and the girls stay behind in Barcelona. The father left. Thelma's mother grew ever more controlling, and Thelma had no one to protect her from the volcanic outbursts that erupted with the slightest provocation. Worse, her mother dropped hateful stories about Thelma's father, painting him as an irredeemable womanizer who'd abandoned them all. This was a direct contradiction of Thelma's own experiences with her dad, but she was still too young to fully reject her mom's narrative. Then World War I broke out, leaving Europe drenched in chaos. Thelma's mother decided England would be safer than Spain. An odd choice, but that's what she did. She packed up the twins, dropped them off in a strange country, and left to join her husband. Thelma and her sister suddenly found themselves in unfamiliar territory without either parent by their side. Though it was stressful, this stage in Thelma's life was also a crash course in independence, and it was an independence her mother would have been horrified to see. At only 11 years old, Thelma pulled off a con that would be impressive for someone 3 times her age. She learned her dad was sailing to New York aboard a ship called the New Amsterdam. Longing to join him, she forged a telegram requesting passage for herself and her twin sister, then brazenly submitted it to the American Consul General. Days ticked by, and Thelma said nothing to her mother. Finally, her mother received a real telegram confirming that the girls were booked on the New Amsterdam at the father's request. You can imagine Laura Morgan's reaction. She was incandescent with rage, and Thelma confessed everything. But at that point, it was too late to undo. Thelma and Gloria were going to New York. At the time, Thelma couldn't fully grasp how monumental this journey would be, but she quickly developed a love for the city that never sleeps. Whenever she had to leave, she was always itching to get back. By the time she was 16, Thelma had convinced her mother to let her and her sister live on their own. If you think that's an enormous amount of freedom for a teenage girl, you're right. New York in the early 1920s was a place of flappers, jazz clubs, and the mesmerizing swirl of Prohibition-era speakeasies. It could be a minefield for naive high society girls who had some connections, but very little money of their own. Though Thelma was somewhat worldly from all that traveling, she wasn't exactly wise about romance or the dangers lurking behind certain charming smiles. So when she met James Vale Converse, the grandson of a former AT&T president, she fell headlong into an irresistible fling. This man was older, darkly handsome, and more than adept at weaving tall tales about his supposed business ventures. The red flags were obvious, but Thelma was too starstruck to see them. It wasn't long before she found herself in a precarious situation she never expected. Despite her family name, Thelma wasn't rich by any means. She had just enough of a connection to attend elegant parties and be labeled a socialite, but not enough financial clout to sustain that lifestyle. She decided to try acting to supplement her income, which in those days was considered a scandalous move for a respectable girl. It turned out to be physically dangerous, too. While on the set of a film called The Young Diana, a malfunctioning fan blew dust and debris directly into her eyes for hours. The next day, she woke up to discover she could no longer see. Talk about terrifying. A doctor arrived and prescribed castor oil treatments on the hour, a grueling process that left Thelma's eyes stinging. But the emotional toll was just as heavy. She believed she might remain blind forever. Who remained by her side, cooing words of support? James Converse. And when her sight finally returned, the emotional roller coaster had reached its peak, leaving Thelma's defenses almost non-existent. So naturally she said yes when Converse proposed marriage. She was just 17 years old and possibly still reeling from the fear of blindness. The honeymoon phase didn't last long. After the excitement of their elopement, Thelma discovered that Converse had a serious drinking problem, seemed to know only how to borrow money from questionable individuals, and was a generally nasty man when intoxicated. Things only spiraled from there, culminating in a heartbreak that no woman should have to endure. She became pregnant, a fact that thrilled her but outraged her husband. Instead of caring for his expectant wife, he sulked like a child about having to share her attention with a baby. Tragically, Thelma suffered a miscarriage, even more tragically, when she lay in the hospital emotionally shattered. Her husband greeted the news with disgusting cheer. He was thrilled the pregnancy was over. That was it for Thelma. She separated from him on the spot and never looked back, setting off on a new adventure that would lead her straight into Hollywood's orbit. During her time in high society circles, Thelma had hobnobbed with film directors and stage personalities. So it was no surprise that she soon found herself offered a part in a silent film called The Society Scandal, directed by Alan Dwan, and starring the glamorous Gloria Swanson. For Thelma, it was a chance to reclaim her life, so she took it. Her role was small. She had to ride a horse under a bridge. The problem? She had zero experience riding. That detail, though, didn't stop her. Whether it was sheer youthful bravado, desperation for a break, or both, she climbed onto that horse and tried to bring the scene to life. The horse spooked at the sound echoing overhead and bolted, nearly tossing her off. It was a miracle she wasn't gravely hurt. Still, she seemed to relish this brush with danger. Instead of being discouraged, she used it as fuel. Before long, she'd packed her bags for Hollywood. Now, Thelma's mother and twin sister absolutely disapproved. They believed a young woman of Thelma's standing had no business in showbiz, which at the time was often seen as a domain for less proper women. But Thelma went anyway, and it didn't take her long to land a small part in Cytherea, one of the earliest color films ever produced. However, success in Tinseltown was fleeting. She caught the eye of an older actor named Richard Bennett, father of future screen icons Joan and Constance Bennett. At first, Thelma was enamored with his intense dedication to the craft. Soon, though, she recognized that acting demanded a sacrifice she wasn't willing to make. That, and perhaps the novelty, wore off. She ended her brief affair with Bennett, realized Hollywood wasn't her true calling, and decided to pivot back to the world she understood best, high society. And that's where her life took a fateful turn when she met a British nobleman named Marmaduke Furness. Marmaduke was nothing like the manipulative or oppressive men she'd known before. He was wealthy, charming, and gave Thelma a taste of real power. One of the richest men in Britain, he surrounded himself with staff and luxury. Suddenly, Thelma was stepping onto private yachts, traveling in style, and having rare dishes flown in on a whim. She was also meeting the aristocratic set, and to her relief, Marmaduke's children from his previous marriage took to her. The press, however, noticed this romance right away. They saw the potential for scandal. Thelma was still technically married to James Converse during the early days of her relationship with Marmaduke. Reporters pursued her for interviews, hungry for the scandalous angle, but Thelma and Marmaduke were skilled at evasion. For months, their romance unfolded behind closed doors. Eventually, Thelma's divorce was finalized, and she and Marmaduke decided to marry in a small, low-key ceremony on June 27, 1926. She became Viscountess Furness, and for a brief, shining moment, life sparkled. She had the aristocratic title, the wealth, the children, 2 stepchildren who seemed to like her, and most of all, a sense of security. If her story had ended there, Thelma might have lived a content life out of the headlines. But fate was about to intervene in a way that no one could have predicted, not even Thelma herself. Because the day after her wedding, she received an invitation to a glamorous gathering attended by no less than the Prince of Wales, Edward VIII in waiting. And that was only the first ripple in a tidal wave of drama. When Thelma met Edward that evening, she recognized his face instantly. He was handsome, but she felt no immediate thunderbolt. Their affair wouldn't begin until 3 years later, and even then, it wasn't some predestined romance. Instead, it grew from a mixture of frustration and heartbreak in Thelma's marriage. The couple's honeymoon period lasted for a while, and Thelma soon found herself pregnant with Marmaduke's child, a miracle for someone who'd previously suffered a miscarriage. However, tragedy came knocking yet again. She gave birth prematurely to a son named William Anthony on March 31, 1929. Though the baby was fragile, he survived, and so did Thelma. But she was emotionally and physically drained, craving affection and stability she no longer found in her crumbling marriage. Marmaduke, who had once seemed so devoted, began to drift away. Some people whispered that he was off having affairs. Others said he was absorbed in his business. Either way, Thelma sensed him pulling away and sank into loneliness, occupying herself with her new baby and stepchildren. In a moment of either boredom or curiosity, she made a playful bet with Marmaduke at a party. The famed Peggy Hopkins was in attendance, and Thelma bet her husband he couldn't get Hopkins to dance with him. Well, guess what? He did. The harmless game left Thelma vaguely unsettled. Then the rumor mill started churning out stories that Marmaduke was seeing other women, perhaps even Peggy Hopkins. The more Thelma tried to ignore these rumors, the more the press hammered at the suggestion that her seemingly picture-perfect union was in trouble. Over time, she and Marmaduke grew so far apart that on nights he was away, she simply assumed he might be with someone else. It was during this desolate emotional landscape that she crossed paths with Edward again at a fair where her stepdaughter had invited her. The prince recognized Thelma instantly and approached her with a beaming smile. She might have been uneasy, but Edward exuded warmth and charm. He asked her to join him in London for dancing. Thelma figured, if her husband could do as he pleased, why shouldn't she accept an invitation from the Prince of Wales? Their catching-up session evolved into flirtations that electrified them both. Soon, Thelma found herself invited for weekend getaways at Fort Belvedere, Edward's secluded castle-like residence. The two of them spent hours talking, dancing, and sharing confidences. Sometimes Thelma's father was there, surprisingly supportive of her high-profile rendezvous. It wasn't long before Thelma realized she'd fallen deeply in love with the man who would one day become King of England, and Edward reciprocated with equal intensity. He seemed starved for genuine affection, someone who would see him as a person rather than a figurehead. The media had no clue how serious this relationship was, nor did Marmaduke, for that matter, who was frequently gone anyway. The one person who did have a strong sense of what was happening, ironically enough, was Thelma's mother. Not that it changed anything. The storm was gathering, and Thelma was about to be center stage in one of the most dramatic royal scandals ever. But first, let's introduce the other woman who'd become so important in this story, Wallis Simpson. Thelma met Wallis around 1930 or 1931. She found Wallis fun, energetic, a bit sharp-tongued, and definitely witty. She never saw Wallis as a threat, quite the opposite. She considered Wallis a friend. In a fateful twist, Thelma even introduced Edward to Wallis, thinking the two could become friendly acquaintances. Who could blame her? She had no crystal ball to predict that Edward and Wallis would go on to have one of the most infamous romances of the century. But that lay in the future. For now, Thelma felt relatively secure in her arrangement with Edward. After all, she realized marriage was off the table. Edward was a future king, and her own complicated background would make the idea of a royal wedding impossible. Still, she told herself that their bond was based on love, and she found solace in that. Then, in January 1934, her twin sister invited her to come visit California. The trip would last 5 or 6 weeks. Naturally, Edward was apprehensive about being apart from Thelma for so long. But Thelma, eager for a change of scenery and possibly feeling the pull of that twin sister connection, decided to go. Before leaving, though, she made a request that would haunt her forever. She asked Wallis Simpson to keep Edward company while she was gone. Just entertain him, go for lunches, maybe attend a few social gatherings, help him pass the lonely weekends. And off Thelma went, none the wiser. In California, Thelma kept in touch with Edward through telegrams and occasional calls. She loved hearing his voice, and for all she knew, their relationship was still strong. Yes, Edward sounded a bit distracted at times, but she chalked it up to him being busy with royal duties. She also drew the attention of another suitor, the dashing and fabulously wealthy Prince Ali Khan. He showered her with flowers and flattery, urging her to delay her return to London. But Thelma said no. Edward was the one she cared for, and she had no desire to linger too long in America, no matter how enchanting Ali Khan might be. So she returned to London, expecting a warm reunion with Edward. Instead, she got a chilly reception from a man who was once smitten. Edward confronted her about rumors that she'd been enjoying Ali Khan's lavish displays of affection. Confused, Thelma turned to Wallis Simpson for advice, unaware that the real reason for Edward's change in mood was standing right in front of her, wearing the mask of a friend. Soon the betrayal became impossible to ignore. At a weekend gathering, meant to be a fun couple's retreat, Thelma noticed the constant secret glances passing between Edward and Wallis. A phone call came for Simpson from Edward, and it all clicked in Thelma's mind. She'd been replaced. The shock was crushing. She'd built her whole world around this man, even if it was a world that could never lead to marriage. To discover he'd carried on behind her back with her friend was more than she could handle. She left them both behind in bitter anger. Perhaps to soothe her wounded pride, she started seeing Prince Ali Khan, who was more than happy to pick up where he'd left off. But that romance, too, eventually fizzled. Thelma walked away once more with a broken heart. Yet her life wasn't defined solely by tragic love stories. In the years that followed, Thelma remained close to her twin sister, Gloria. When Gloria needed her for emotional or medical support, Thelma never hesitated. She was there in 1947 when Gloria underwent a botched surgical procedure. Thelma sank every available penny into paying the medical bills, even reaching out to Gloria's daughter for funds, though the mother-daughter relationship was quite strained. Through grit and loyalty, Thelma helped nurse Gloria back to health, but soon the sisters faced another emotional blow. Their mother, that formidable and often terrifying matriarch, fell gravely ill. Despite all the trauma she'd caused them, Thelma went to her mother's side. In 1955, her mother passed away. Though her mother left a decent sum to Gloria, Thelma apparently got little to nothing, or at least not enough to impact her life in any lavish way. She went on, relying on her twin in a small circle of loved ones, forging a quiet existence that was light years away from the glitz and scandal of her heyday. But the echoes of her past followed her until the very end. On January 29, 1970, at the age of 65, Thelma passed away on her way to a doctor's appointment. Some accounts say she might have died of a heart attack, others that it was a sudden stroke. But one detail stands out, one that underscores just how deeply she'd once loved Edward, or at least the memory of him. According to her niece, Gloria Vanderbilt, Thelma carried with her a little worn-down teddy bear that the Prince of Wales had given her years earlier. It was threadbare, a relic from that golden time when she and Edward shared private weekends away from the public eye. That small stuffed toy was still in Thelma's handbag, almost like a tangible piece of her heartbreak, all these decades later. So there you have it, the extraordinary saga of Thelma Furness, from possible Spanish royalty to mother-daughter fights that escalated to acts of extreme cruelty, from forging telegrams to forging a name in Hollywood, from a tempestuous first marriage to a glamorous second one, from dancing with the future King of England to losing him to a friend she trusted. And yet, despite the heartbreak, she never stopped seeking love and caring for those dear to her, especially her twin sister, whose near-death experience would later test Thelma's resolve. Even at the end, she carried a tiny reminder of the love she'd once had, a teddy bear that was practically falling apart, much like the illusions of her youth. While Edward VIII's story with Wallis Simpson might make headlines for centuries, it's Thelma's saga that provides a behind-the-scenes look at the dominoes that led to one of the most shocking abdications in royal history. She was the stepping stone, the lost chapter, the woman whose heartbreak gave rise to a bigger scandal. And perhaps, if the world had taken more notice of her trials, her mother's cruelty, her naive acceptance of an older man's tall tales, her near blindness, her starry-eyed love for a prince, her stoic acceptance of betrayal, she might be a figure that appears more prominently in the footnotes of Edward's story. But Thelma Furness stands on her own as a fascinating personality, a testament to resilience, ambition, and, most of all, the very human desire for love and belonging, even when it comes with disastrous consequences. If you find yourself imagining the Grand Hotel National again, or hearing the flutter of pigeon wings, or picturing that galloping horse under a Hollywood bridge, or glimpsing a forlorn teddy bear clutched in an aging socialite's handbag, that's Thelma's enduring spirit echoing through time. She reminds us that behind every headline-grabbing romance is a tapestry of lesser-known stories, stories of heartbreak, bravery, and the sharp turns of fate. In Thelma's world, illusions may have shattered and loyalties may have been betrayed, but her fiery determination to carve out her own destiny remains unforgettable. Now, whenever someone mentions Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson, you might just think back to Thelma Furness, the woman who loved him first and paid the ultimate price of stepping aside, unintentionally, so that history could play out one of its grandest and messiest love stories.